book 5 acts as a mediation or a midway break in between the heavy emotional drama of book 4 and again some emotional drama that will take place in book 6. In book 5, we are mourning the loss of Anchises, who Aeneas told us died in book 3, and we're celebrating him with the funeral games. We've seen these games being used before in the Iliad. Achilles threw the games for Patroclus. These are athletic games to really showcase the skills of the youths. We also saw it in the Odyssey when Odysseus is at the Phaeacians. They don't have funeral games, but they have celebratory games, athletic games, to show the different skills of the young men. And they are getting to do horse races and lots of different ways of showcasing their manly skill. Remember that virtue at this time would have been equated with manliness, with their ability to have these kinds of skills. We also should get an understanding of the gymnastics here. This was connected with piety, that the ability to control one's body, right, to be able to have your body respond as your soul desired, as your will desired, would have been seen as virtuous, as pious, that these things would have been closely connected. And later classical schools are going to use these ideas of piety and gymnastics as kind of being the foundation for early childhood study. The ability to be virtuous, to have the right desires, being connected with how children relate to the world physically around them. I think also in book 5 we get to see the showcase of the last Trojan tradition, right? The ancient world that Aeneas has been part of, and he's paying respect to his father. But the last time that we will see any of this past Trojanness will be by book 6, the underworld, and Aeneas will descend as a Trojan and then rise, of course, as a hero ready to start the Roman tradition, the Roman line. And so this is a significant kind of grand finale of the Trojan ways of doing things. It's emphasized by the poet when he says the boys are Troy and their formation Trojan. And with this, the Sainted Fathers Games concluded. The games end, and this is kind of our grand example of what it means to be Trojan with these games. I'm also mentioning Chariots of Fire here because the sense that when he's running, the main character feels God's pleasure in him from running, and the close association between the gymnastic, between the body as being the place where you can sense and feel things that are even beyond just the physical elation. And we get a sense of that when we get to hear the way that Virgil describes these athletic games. There's also tragedy that occurs in this part of the book. The Trojan women are incited by Iris, who has been sent by Juno to infuri them. They are turned into furies in some ways, the way they rave and rage, and they shriek, and they set fire to the Trojan ships. In some sense, this had to happen in the narrative because the Latin line is going to be joined with the Trojan line. It can't be joined with the Trojan line if all of the Latin men have, or all the Trojan men has only Trojan wives. You have to have Trojan men without Trojan wives who can join with Latin women and thus begin the Roman race. And so, at least on a historical level, Virgil as a poet has to solve that problem, but he does not necessarily want a mass genocide of Trojan women. And so the Trojan women are left behind, the majority of them, on this island at this shore. This will be one of the last times that we get to see the Trojan women involved in the story after they burn these ships. And later we'll get to see someone, Turnus, will set fire to the Trojan ships and they will actually transform. So it's interesting here that the Trojan ships do not transform, and you wonder if these Trojan ships were made of something different than the other Trojan ships, how these Trojan ships were able to be burned and the others were turned into nymphs. And so there's lots of questions about what's going on here with the inconsistency between the Trojan ships and their identity as Trojan ships. But at this point, it also allows the strongest of the group to kind of be weeded out from those who really don't see their fate as Roman and who are still holding on to Troy. Because going forward, they cannot hold on as strongly to their Trojan identity as they become Romans. And so we'll see this, that there's a figure who will speak to Aeneas, who will act as kind of a Nestor in the scene, who will tell Aeneas what to do. Go ahead and just move on with your voyage. This isn't enough for him, so Anchises' ghost will actually come to Aeneas and tell him that you must choose the hardiest among the Trojans, and with them you will continue. And at this point, Aeneas listens to the wisdom of his father. His father also tells him, you must go into Dis and you must find me and talk to me, and you need to see the Roman descendants that are to come. And that'll move us to the underworld, where he will actually go and see his father. In order to descend into the underworld, unlike when Odysseus ventured to the underworld and had to cross the river of ocean, and Calypso did not give him a guide and didn't give him very specific instructions for how to find this place. Instead, Aeneas actually needs the Sibyl to be his guide. So he goes to the Sibyl to find the underworld, and instead of the underworld coming to him, he goes into the underworld. He actually journeys down, so there's a descent here. The Sibyl prophesies that your perils on the sea are finally over. So this is book 6. The Odyssey will end with book 6, is what Virgil is telling us, but worse will come. So books 7 through 12, be assured the Trojans will arrive, Lavinium's land, though, will make them wish they hadn't. I see war, grisly war, and the Tiber frothing blood. Juno will cling to hounding you. Anchises has just revealed that the Trojan women burned the ships because of Juno's intervention, because Juno's rage was against him. So Aeneas knows that Juno is against him. We also know that the river Tiber tells Aeneas to sacrifice all the piglets to Juno to try to overcome her rage. So he's very aware that Juno has been kind of harboring this hatred against him that he is unable to appease. And so hear it again from the Sibyl that Juno is against him and will not let up. And unlike when Circe told Odysseus to go into the underworld and didn't give him very clear instructions about how to find the underworld, Aeneas needs the Sibyl to tell him how to get into the underworld and to go with him as a guide into the underworld. Odysseus did not go into the underworld, but stood at the mouth of it as the souls rose to meet him. Instead, at this point, Aeneas will actually venture underground. In the Odyssey, when Calypso said, yes, you can leave me, though when you leave my island, you're going to wish you hadn't, the Sibyl sounds very reminiscent of this when she says, your troubles on the sea are over, but you're going to wish you had never made land. You're going to wish you had never gotten to the Lavinium shore because of the war that is coming. It is going to make the Tiber froth with blood. And this is similar to when Achilles is slaying so many people that the river is choked with corpses and gets angry at Achilles for killing so many of her people. So here we have in book 6, the end of the journey by descending into the underworld. And Aeneas goes with the Sibyl below. It is a very different underworld from that undertaken by Odysseus, the one that he saw. First, the Sibyl tells him, the road to Avernus is easy, right? This becomes our famous saying now, the road to hell is easy, but it's really hard to get out. So the descent is easy, but to get out of hell is very hard. She tells him that he must pluck a branch for Persephone, or here in the Romanized Proserpina. It should fall in your hand if fate has summoned you. If not, your whole strength will fail and you will not be able to tear it off with hard steel. What's interesting is this kind of the hesitation of the golden bough becomes a moment that scholars just dwell on quite a bit, because the seer has told him it's an either or situation. Either you will pluck the golden bough and it's just going to come off in your hand easily, or you will just not be able to pull it, kind of like a sword in the stone moment. Instead, we have the fated hero struggling with this sword in the stone, and it hesitates and then comes off in his hand. Why does it hesitate? What does that mean? What does that signify? And of course, no one really knows what it is meant to signify. but there seems to be some curiosity here about whether or not Aeneas was meant to go into hell. And yet this golden bough that he brings does provide him an entrance. It is kind of his golden ticket into the underworld. Let's compare the two underworlds. As I mentioned, Odysseus, the souls must come up to him. They must drink blood in order to speak. And if you notice, everyone has the same punishment in the afterlife, whether they were good or bad. So you have the suitors that die at the end of the Odyssey, and they're joining the heroes Achilles and Agamemnon. They're all on the same level. There are no levels in hell. And yet in Virgil's world, there are 9 loops right down into hell. There are 9 levels of descent, and there's a difference between Tartarus, where Aeneas overhears shrieks and pains of punishment, and the world of the Elysian fields, where Anchises is, that seems luxurious. It's where the poets and the heroes are. So there is if you are blessed, if you live a pious life, you go to the Elysian fields, and if you leave a wicked life, then you're going to go to Tartarus. What's also notable is that on these other levels, you have the innocents. You have the babies that are born who have hurt no one, but also not done any good. So they are neither in the Elysian fields nor they're in Tartarus. You have those who were innocently accused. So they're executed as criminals, which would put them in Tartarus, but they didn't do anything wrong, put them in Elysian, and they're kind of in this middle limbo place. And then you have these loves, and that's where he will, of course, see Dido. These rejected lovers that are kind of wandering around. All of this is a model then for Dante when he writes the Divine Comedy, and we have the 9 levels of descent into hell. And here we have the 9 loops of Styx. We have Charon, the ferryman, who will actually cross the souls. He will take them over. He at first doesn't want to take Aeneas, but then sees the golden bough and is just astonished because it had been so many years since he had seen this golden bough, and we'll look at that scene. And there's several monsters that will have return again and again throughout myths and throughout Western culture. Cerberus, the 3-headed dog. We have the Hydra, and we have lots of different people watching the gates of hell. There are gates, there's places of entrance and exit that we'll look at. And so this is a much more thorough or complex creation of an underworld than we saw in the Odyssey. So again, Virgil is telling his own story in the Aeneid. He is not just repeating the stories that have come before, but he's elaborating on them and drawing distinctions for his own purposes. Aeneas does see Dido, and this is a very different response in the underworld than the one that he gave when Dido was alive. A woman now, for fate had changed her back. Phoenician Dido wandered in that broad wood, her wound still fresh, and when the Trojan hero encountered her and recognized her dim form through shadows, as a person sees the new moon through clouds, or thinks he sees it as it rises, he wept and spoke to her in tender love. Poor Dido, my queen, it was against my will I left your country. And her eyes stayed on the ground, her face averted, as changeless in expression while he spoke. There is so much to unpack in this scene. We should feel for Dido because Dido was not the predator in the seduction between her and Aeneas. She really was at the whim of the gods. And so in this moment it becomes even more tragic when we get to see her in the underworld, even though she is now connected with her former husband who doesn't say anything and we don't even see what he looks like. But there is a sense of reuniting. That reuniting doesn't overcome the hurt that she feels having left Aeneas, right? And Aeneas having left her. And he says, poor Dido, right? It's in Felix Dido, unhappy Dido becomes usually the moniker used, though Sarah Rudin doesn't use it here. She says poor, but it's in Felix. It's unlucky, it's unhappy, unblessed Dido, right? So she did not have the blessing conferred upon her by the gods. She had a fortune or a fate that was negative, a fortune and a fate that was actually not to her benefit. My queen, I did not want to leave your shores, right? Unwillingly, I left your shores. This line, as Elizabeth Van Diver points out, has actually been reused from Catullus' poetry, Catullus being a contemporary of Virgil and or a generation right before, and he would have inherited these humorous poems from Catullus, but he reuses it with dramatic effect here by writing about something so significant as Dido and this loss of a great love, which Catullus does not use. He actually has it in a more satirical verse. But here it takes on greater weight. And so Virgil is drawing from these masters that have come before him, but using it to great effect and beauty in the way that he rewrites these scenes. It's also an interesting moment, the way that Dido moves away from Aeneas. She keeps her eyes averted. She is listening to him, but she does not rebuke him any longer. She does not speak to him with the fury and passion that she spoke to him when she left. In fact, her suicide seems to be her final say to him. Her final act was, I killed myself, I called a curse upon you, and I'm not revoking it. The way that she looks away from him should remind us of Ajax not being willing to talk to Odysseus. If you remember from the Odyssey, Ajax was supposed to receive Achilles' armor because he was the second to Achilles in battle, according to the Iliad, and yet Odysseus receives Achilles' armor as a prize at the end of the Trojan War, and Ajax is so angry at this he falls on his own sword. And then when he sees Odysseus comes to hell, he refuses to talk to him. And now we have Dido refusing to talk to Aeneas and actually turning away from him. The epic simile is also interesting here. It says that her dim form threw shadows as a person when he sees the new moon through the clouds or thinks he sees it. So there's this hesitation where he does know her, and yet the vision of her almost troubles him or confuses him in the way that a person thinks they see the new moon through the clouds, but do they or do they not? This kind of lack of sureness that's reflected in the epic simile. And we have Dido being seen as this shade of her former self. Does he see her? Does he know her? Is she the same person as she was before? And I think this should be very troubling for Christians because our understanding of the afterlife is so different. When you move into the afterlife in a Christian world, the things that were here on earth are less real than the things that are in heaven. The things that are in heaven are more real in the afterlife, so that things get, your perception and awareness of reality, your whole existence becomes greater. Whereas in the Greek or ancient Roman conceptions, after this life, things get less real. Things become shadows or shades of what was. They are degraded in a sense after death, and this is the world that seems to have the greater sense of realness to it. And you become a shade of your former self. You become the soul without the shell of the body. And that's, of course, not the conception in the Christian world. And so we also have to keep in mind, even as we're comparing the Aeneid to the Odyssey and the Iliad, we should also be comparing the Aeneid to the Christian conception of the afterlife, which we'll try to do several times by comparing it with Dante too.